It is my pleasure today to introduce to you Dr. Scott Kelly, our presenter, and he is going to be kicking off our inaugural Beer with an Engineer annual event. So we are looking to do this on an annual basis. Um, Dr. Scott is a faculty member in Mechanical Engineering and Engineering Science Department, and he started there back in 2007. He originally grew up in the New York metropolitan area and studied mechanical engineering at Cornell and also at Caltech. So he got his Bachelor's of Science in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering from Cornell University and his MS and PhD in Mechanical Engineering from California Institute of Technology. He worked at Silicon Valley, in a startup during the dot-com bubble, and taught at the University of Illinois before moving to Charlotte and joining the Department of Mechanical Engineering here. As we heard earlier in the conversation, he would be kind of probably embarrassed to tell you how many cats that he has or how many guitars, but let's just say that his wife is very indulgent. We are very honored and pleased to have Scott present to us today and looking forward to the talk. So Scott, take it away.
Thanks. Let me try to share screen. And I need to not watch the chat because people keep saying things that I think are funny and it's distracting. Not a complaint, keep saying funny things. That wasn't meant to shush anybody. Yeah, so let me start off by sending thanks in multiple directions. So thanks to the Dean's office for inviting me to do this. Special thanks to Christine, who put a ton of work into putting this together. I'm sure it seems like it's easy, but it's really not. And the marketing alone, I think, was a huge headache, and she's been a star about that. But then also, thanks to the audience. There's a weird way to do this, right? In the fall, we'll all gather in person, and it will be natural to raise a beer with an engineer. You all understand we can't give you beer via Zoom, right? I assume so. In the fall, it will be a natural thing to do this. It's a little strange this way, and so I really appreciate those of you who came out just to show support for the college, or because you know me from years past, or whatever. So that's awesome. So because this is the first event in this series, the expectations are open-ended. I think that let me ask, actually, you can see and hear me okay, right? Yes?
Absolutely, yeah.
Sure can.
Yep.
Just because I don't see me on my screen, I see something else, so I just want to make sure. So thanks, Tyler. I suspect that the organizers would be content if at the end of this event, you just had an idea of who I was and what sorts of problems I find interesting, but I have a slightly more ambitious personal goal. So I want to teach you something. I'm going to describe a research problem that interests me, but then I also want to try to describe to you how to solve that problem. Because this particular problem that I want to talk about has these clickbaity ads you see on the internet where there's this one weird trick, right? So this particular problem has this one weird trick that unlocks the problem, and I think it's nifty, and so I want to share that niftiness with you. In order for me to do that, there's going to be a little bit of math and physics. So if you're an engineering student or a former engineering student, you will not regard this talk as a technical talk. But I just wanted to say that I'm sure there are some people in the audience who are not technical people in that sense. So if I start to say things that seem a little math and physicsy, it's not going to get worse. Bear with me. I want to invoke some abstraction. And so I need to use a little bit of mathy language to sort of get the abstraction properly set in your head. Anyway, so a problem of broad interest to me is a problem of designing robots that can be set loose in the world to operate autonomously. So this talk is not about applications of such things, but it's easy to think of applications. You can set robots loose on land, in the sea, in the air, and they can do environmental monitoring, they can pick up garbage, they can track animals, they can spy on your friends and enemies. Today, I want to focus specifically on robots that will be deployed in fluids, and I want to talk about what makes for a good physical robot design if your goal is to have your robot be able to move through a fluid in an agile and efficient way. So I'm still talking quite broadly and abstractly. When I say fluid, I might mean, we're talking about boat-sized robot fish that we throw in the ocean, but I might mean we're talking about gigantic articulated blimp things floating on the atmosphere of Venus, which is a thing, not the atmosphere of Venus, but the idea of deploying blimps there. Or maybe I'm talking about micro scale things that will swim around in your blood and attack the ailments that you have, which is a thing, at least at a fantasy level. So these are all fluid environments. And I want to talk broadly about, picture any of these environments. What would make a good design for a robot, and how should that robot operate in order to be able to move around in that environment, right? So even if you're new to this problem, the first thing that comes to your mind is, ooh, I know things that swim well. They're called animals. This problem has already been solved by nature. If you want to make robots that swim around well, you should just copy animals with robots, right? Because they exist on all the scales I just mentioned. There are great big animals that move around in the oceans. There are little microscopic things that are arguably animals, right? That operate in the inside your body scale, right? So this field of copying animals in the design of robots is called biomimetics, and it's totally a good idea to look to nature for inspiration for these things. I have a personal sort of, pet sensitivity to this topic. So I would suggest that although mimicking animals in your robot designs is a good idea kind of at a course level, that one can go overboard with it, pardon the pun, because if you just straight up copy an animal when making a robot, you don't really know what engineering problem you're solving, right? So, if you think of your favorite fish, I have no doubt that your favorite fish is a better swimmer than all of your favorite fish adjacent things that you could imagine. But the shape of that fish and the way it swims, that's probably not just optimized for swimming, right? Fish are optimized for some complicated and hidden combination of reasons that involve swimming well and being difficult to eat and being sexy to other fish. And if you don't really understand why fish are designed the way they are or move the way they do, then you might be complicating things overly much for yourself in your robot fish, or you might be making something that's actually suboptimal for your goals. So I propose that we adjust the idea of blindly copying animals in our robot designs by doing something like look at the animals that we want to copy, try to think about what the most elemental abstraction of those animals is. Think of the most distilled form of what you think is inspiring about the way animals swim around, and realize that in the most primitive way, and really understand the physics of that and optimize that. So start off with inspiration from nature, but don't proceed without understanding what you're doing, and try to understand what you're doing by starting as simply as possible. In fact, to anchor this philosophy in your mind, I'm going to share an anecdote with you. So I've always been fond of the mathematical symbol called nabla. You might not know the name. You've seen the symbol if you ever took a calculus class or a physics class. So this is the symbol that looks like a triangle with two of the sides fat and one of the points pointing down. On the right, I've just captured from the internet a picture of Maxwell's equations, so you'll recognize this symbol if you ever took electromagnetism in college. So the reason this symbol is called nabla is that that's more or less the name in Aramaic for a harp that looks like that. So this is probably one of the reasons I've always liked the symbol, is because of the name. Rob mentioned earlier, I'm a collector of stringed instruments. So anyway, so when I arrived at the University of Illinois, 20 years ago, for my first faculty position, they said to me, welcome, you need to tell us the name of your lab for our brochure, and wink, wink, nudge, nudge, it should be a clever acronym. And I thought, oh, for goodness sake, it should be a clever acronym. My interests are sort of subtle and diverse. I'm supposed to capture this in a clever acronym. They probably want me to come up with something with the word biomimetics in it, because they hired me based on this talk I gave where I was making snake robots and fish robots and all this, but like, it's not biomimetics. Like, whatever my lab does, it's really not a biomimetics lab. And then I thought, wait a minute, not a biomimetics lab. That's it. It comes with its own logo. So I actually submitted it to the brochure that the name of my lab was not a biomimetics lab. They totally did not print that in the department brochure. I still think it was a good idea. So you won't see it in the brochure at UNC Charlotte either, but if you see my Miata tooling down the highway, you'll know that it's me. Anyway, right. So I propose that we think of what's the simplest animal-like swimmer and talk about what's optimal or not optimal about that design. Nick Horvath in the chat is asking what happened to the license plate that's a cartoon of a cat. That's on the other end of my car. So by all means, look for my Miata on the road. I have good plates on both ends. So I propose that the simplest animal-like swimmer I can think of is 3 rigid things linked together at 2 joints. Why? Well, if you think about fish or snakes or various invertebrates that swim, people, when they do certain swimming strokes, I think the fundamental mechanism that's animal-y is the tendency to undulate. What's the simplest thing that undulates? Something with 2 joints in it. So I want to talk for today just about a 2-jointed swimming device like the one that we saw there. And I hope the video is playing smooth enough that you saw those joints move. That object obviously is symmetric, whether you look at it from one end or the other. But since I want to talk about these 2 joints moving as if they were different, we will call one end of that robot the head and the other end of the robot the tail. So there are these 2 angles between the middle part and the 2 end parts. I'm going to call one of those the head angle and one of those the tail angle. Okay, here's a mathematical abstraction. How are we going to visualize the idea of a swimming stroke in terms of a repetitive change over time in the head angle and the tail angle? Imagine I had a piece of graph paper. So one axis on the graph paper is the head angle axis. The other axis on the graph paper is the tail angle axis. If I do that, then any cyclic deformation of the 2 joints of that robot corresponds to a closed loop in that plane. So for example, if I had a square loop in that plane, that would correspond to first hold one joint still and move the other joint, then hold that joint still and move the first joint, and then unmove the first joint and unmove the second joint. That's a closed loop because at the end, the robot ends up in the same shape internally that it started out in. But so maybe if I set that robot free in a fluid and it executed that kind of shape change, it would propel itself. So that's an example of a potential swimming gait. What would a different loop look like? If I picked a circular loop, okay, a circular loop corresponds to both of those joints moving simultaneously, but sort of out of phase with each other. So that's what a circular loop swimming motion would look like. With this abstraction in place, the question I want to ask and answer today is, what makes for the best swimming stroke for our little 3-link robot? And so that's the same as asking, okay, what's the best shaped loop to draw in that plane? So that's the problem that we want to optimize, for which I think I have a sort of clever way to think about things. So before I can talk about the solution to that problem, I need to tell you a little bit about fluids. So fluids are complicated things. They do all sorts of diverse there are all sorts of diverse phenomena in fluids. One common way to organize a hierarchy of fluid behaviors is along a scale like the one I've drawn here, on one end of which things get more and more viscous, and on the other end of which things get less and less viscous. So by viscous, I mean sticky, like honey or corn syrup are more viscous fluids than water, for instance. And what's interesting about this scale is that there are actually regions along this scale in which just because of this sort of shifting viscosity, the basic physics of the environment are qualitatively different. So if I were to drop you in a swimming pool full of water and you had to find the best swimming stroke, the best swimming stroke is qualitatively a different thing from the best swimming stroke if I dropped you in a pool of honey. It's not just that you should swim the same way in the honey, but you'll go slower because it's stickier. There are actual differences in what the best way to move your limbs is. Now I say more and less viscous because I think that's a good way to imagine the difference, but there are surrogates for those quantities along this axis. So for instance, Uh-oh, my slides are frozen. Why are my slides frozen? There we go. So for instance, if you stay in the same fluid, but move to a smaller physical scale, that actually creates the circumstances of moving from that fluid on the same size scale to a stickier fluid. So more viscous can be equated with zooming in on something really small, or with just moving more slowly. And analogously, less viscous can also correspond to faster or larger. As an illustration of this, here's a movie that I pulled off YouTube from a person whose YouTube channel that I follow, who has these great light microscope movies. So that is an amoeba swimming in water. So water, you don't think of it as sticky, but if you look at how that amoeba is sort of pushing itself through its environment, that doesn't look like water would look on your physical scale, right? That looks like a much thicker, stickier substance. So when I say more viscous, I might also mean smaller. So when we talk about micro robots swimming in your body, we're talking about things that are off there on the left end of that scale. So the punchline about fluids, and this is why we have multiple faculty who study different aspects of fluid dynamics, is pretty much anywhere along that scale, except at the extreme ends, fluids are complicated. These different regimes along that scale that are qualitatively different, they're all hard. In very only rare situations can you actually solve a math problem describing the behavior of a fluid. You can throw computers at these problems, but pretty much fluids are a difficult nut to crack, except at the extreme ends, in the really, really viscous case, such as you might invoke as a model approximating a tiny robot swimming around your body, or in the maybe less intuitive case of really unviscous or big, maybe these are the articulated blimps on the Venusian atmosphere. In those extremes, magical simplifications happen. And it's sort of interesting that physically these are very different extremes. I mean, the physical circumstances are quite different, but in terms of the mathematical structure of the dynamics, they're remarkably similar. What happens at the one end is very similar to what happens at the other end. So what sorts of magical things do I mean? I'll give you a short list. So first of all, at either of these extremes, like the extreme that you saw in that amoeba movie, swimming things don't drift. That amoeba was moving through its environment because it was constantly deforming. If it were to cease to deform, it would immediately be arrested in place. And that's not true if you swim in your pool. You kick a couple times, you can stop changing the shape of your body and you'll glide. That fact complicates things when you swim in your pool. So this is a simplification at either of these two extremes, that there's not a drift component to the dynamics of the swimming thing. In fact, because of this, partly because of number one, one can solve the underlying math problems exactly in many cases. And I mention this because I'm going to show you very few actual movies of robots in this talk, but I'm going to show you a bunch of little cartoons, like the cartoons I've shown you already. But I want you to understand that these cartoons are actual accurate simulations of how the little cartoon robot would move in the fluid environment that we're talking about. So these are physics real simulations, and I'm able to achieve them because I can do the math sort of explicitly. In particular, what's neat about the math is you can understand the math or the physics, you can model the physics mathematically in a sense that I'm going to describe in terms of a notion of curvature. So what I can do exactly for these problems in these extreme circumstances at one end or the other end of the sticky scale is compute a certain sort of curvature-like quantity exactly. And then this curvature idea is going to be the one weird trick that helps you lose 35 pounds. Clickbait. There are two extremes of that scale. I've already remarked that what happens at the one extreme and happens at the other extreme are remarkably similar qualitatively. In fact, they're so similar that I'm going to blur the distinction. For simplicity's sake, for the rest of this talk, I'm just going to be talking about locomotion in one of these extremes where there's no drift and there's some sort of curvature idea that I'm going to clarify. You can imagine that everything I'm saying has to do with little tiny micro robots in your body, but it could just as well have to do with robots on the inviscid end of that scale. Okay, So what do I mean by curvature? Let me attempt a metaphor. So presumably we all know that there are aliens from other planets staring down at us with roof penetrating radar, watching us move about. Almost certainly those aliens are staring in part at New York City because that's a good place to people watch. There's a certain spot in New York City that I have in mind where if you watch the people from above, you will think that they are behaving irrationally. In particular, so there's a picture of the top of a person's head as viewed from deep space ceiling penetrating radar. And people in this particular location in New York City seem to spend their days walking around in circles back and forth. Why would they be doing that? Wonder the space aliens. Well, the spot that I'm thinking of is the Guggenheim Museum in the, was it the East 80s maybe? So if you've been to the Guggenheim, the gallery is a large circular ramp. And while it may look from above like people are walking in circles in the Guggenheim, what they're actually doing is they're ascending and descending a ramp, right? So when that person seems to walk in a circle as viewed from above, what's actually happening is that person is ascending from one level to the next, this art gallery, right? So what you couldn't see from outer space was the fact that there is a curvature to the floor in the vertical plane, in the direction that's not one of the directions you can see. And the degree of curvature is a measure of how far you proceed in this invisible direction when you execute what looks like a loop to the sort of flat observer, right? So maybe that was an awkward metaphor, but the idea that you should plant in your mind is that my notion of curvature is if you see something execute a loop, the curvature is a measure of how far did executing that loop actually make things proceed in some direction that I can't see, okay? So in which space am I going to draw loops and then have this invisible abstraction of curvature? So I claim that we can think of that plane, the head joint, tail joint plane, as being like the horizontal projection of the floor of the Guggenheim. We were drawing loops in that plane before, but I claim that you can think about locomotion associated with some sort of cyclic change in our swimmer's joint angles in terms of curvature assigned to that plane in which we draw loops for joint angle movements. So, okay, if you've actually been following this up to this point, you might think, okay, that's kind of neat, except when the robot moves around in its environment, like there are multiple directions it could go. It could go forward, it could go sideways, it could rotate, right? The Guggenheim example just had one hidden direction, which was up. Yeah, agreed. So the way this is going to work is superposed on that joint angle plane, I'm going to have multiple different notions of curvature. So there's going to be a notion of curvature associated with longitudinal motion of the robot. And there's going to be a notion of curvature associated with lateral motion of the robot. And there's going to be a notion of curvature associated with rotation of the robot. So what I have drawn on the screen are 3 copies of that graph paper plane. You can see the axis labels. And I've represented these hidden curvature quantities with colors. So green is the neutral color. Where you see green, there is no curvature. Where you see blue, there's some curvature in one sense, one direction. And where you see red, there's curvature in the other direction. So this is an abstraction for sure. But the point is, in this extreme driftless situation, either end of the viscosity scale, Reynolds number scale, if you're an engineering student, I can explicitly calculate these color maps for these curvature quantities for a swimmer like our swimmer. So once I've done that calculation, the problem of designing joint motions to achieve locomotion goals is really easy. This is the one weird trick. If I draw these things, which I can extract from just the basic physics equations for fluid flow, then to design a good joint motion, I just look at these pictures and say, okay, where's their curvature of the kind that I want? So for instance, we had a circular loop before. If I draw a circle in the middle, okay, I'm going to show you the movie in a second, but How is that circular joint motion going to make this robot locomote? Well, we look at the leftmost plot and we say, ooh, there's net curvature, more blue than red, in the longitudinal translation plane. So if I loop in that way, the robot's going to go the long way. If I look in the lateral curvature plot, it's closer to 0. It'll move laterally a little bit, but not as much as it'll move longitudinally. Go over to the rotation plot, that's mostly just green. So that's basically 0 curvature. And indeed, I run the movie, and what does that joint angle motion do? It makes that robot go forward a little bit sideways, but not turning around. Great. Our robot is now navigating happily around your bloodstream. What if we wanted it to turn around? How would I design a good joint motion to turn around? Well, just look at the color plot. If I shift that circle up and to the right, I'm still getting longitudinal curvature. I'm still enclosing blue in the left plane. I'm still about neutral in the, only a little bit off neutral in the lateral movement plane. But now I'm enclosing rotation in one direction more than rotation in the other direction. And indeed, that loop corresponds to a good forward and turn gait. So at this point, designing good motions, which at first it's like, how are you going to distinguish? There's an infinite number of choices. How are you going to pick? This curvature metaphor allows you to just design good swimming motions by looking at those pictures and taking your pen and drawing loops of whatever shape surround the kind of curvature that you would like to surround. So that's the neat thing that I wanted to share with you. Neat, you say. Of course, if you're of a certain age, meaning young, I encounter this with engineering students all the time. This will resonate for faculty, right? You try to teach young people how to do any sort of calculation, and they say, do we really have to learn to do this? Won't my computer do this calculation for me? That's totally apt in this setting, right? Why do I need a way to design good robot motions? Like, there's this machine learning thing. We were talking about Google beforehand and what a great employer Google is, right? I mean, can't you just like throw machine learning, whatever that is, at this problem? And the answer I have to say is absolutely. So increasingly over time, machine learning algorithms, specifically what's known as reinforcement learning. So reinforcement learning is the sort of machine learning that enables computers to beat people at chess. The idea is you give the computer the ability to play chess with itself. It can play chess millions and millions of times really fast, and it learns by experience how to play chess well, just by trying stuff and seeing how, that worked well. I'll try variations on that. That worked poorly. I'll never do that again. That's essentially reinforcement learning. So one way to get good robot swimming gaits is give a computer the ability to do the simulations we were just doing and say, screw with these simulations until you find a good swimming gait. Now, I think that when you have a good mathematical understanding and you can draw these curvature plots, it's still quicker to actually do these designs yourself. However, it is interesting to use machine learning to do these things. And so students of mine have done a little bit of this, and I'll show you a result. But I show you the result partly because I think it's funny. It's another thing in the category of when you see a good idea, don't just leap into it headlong without thinking about what you're trying to do. So before I show you the amusing result, I just have to make sure, does everybody know what I mean when I say a magic wallet? So a magic wallet, I had one of these when I was little. I just grabbed this video off some German website. A magic wallet is one of these wallets that doesn't just hinge on one side. You can open and close it on either side. So if you put money in on one side of the little elastic straps, close the wallet on one side, open it on the other side, it's like magic. Now the money is trapped behind the straps, right? And you can do things to pop the money from one segment to the other segment. These things are really easy to make. I encourage you, especially if you have a little kid, go make a magic wallet tonight out of 2 pieces of board and a strap, rubber band. There are instructions online. Anyway, so magic wallets are cool. So I had a student who took the simulator for the 3-link swimmer and fed it to a reinforcement learning algorithm and said, find me the best swimming gait. I'll show you the movie. The reason this movie looks a little different from the other movies in that the water is a different color and the ellipses are a little longer and skinnier, it doesn't mean anything. We just get tired of staring at the same ellipses, so we mix it up because we do a lot of simulations like this in my research group. So I was pretty sure that what the machine learning algorithm was going to come up with was some variant of that circle gate. Was it going to be a circular loop, a square loop, a square with rounded corners loop, something undulatory and snake-like, right? Obviously, that's the best thing. We saw the curvature plots. That's got to be the best thing. Here's what the machine learning algorithm came up with. We neglected to tell the machine learning algorithm that the robot was not allowed to intersect itself. If you don't think about what you're asking a computer to do, the computer will answer a question different from what you thought. I love this movie. I'll play it again. The machine learning algorithm found that the best way to swim is to do the magic wallet thing. In fact, that is the best way to swim. If your robot can intersect itself, that's a super way to swim. Wait, you say, I thought good swimming gaits had to do with enclosing curvature in that joint angle plane. That's just going in one direction in one of the joint angles. How is that enclosing curvature? Ah, think about that plane. We drew it as a plane, but because those angles are angles that wrap around, that graph paper is not a flat piece of graph paper. That graph paper is the skin of a donut. So that is enclosing a loop. It's going round and round and round through the donut hole, keeping the curvature of one kind on one side and the curvature of the other opposite side on the other side. It's very, very clever. So I even, Dawson in the chat says something about donuts. I almost included donuts in the title of the talk. Did it seem like I disparaged machine learning just then because I said that, you know, it'll give you the wrong result because you can't formulate good questions? That's not true at all. So just shout out to another student of mine. We do variants of this swimming problem in which the robot sits not on pink styrofoam rafts, but instead on wheels on the floor. And so we set reinforcement learning loose on a version of this three-link swimmer that sits on wheels here on the floor of student Jesse Redford's house because COVID. Machine learning totally finds the undulatory gait as the optimum gait for a robot like that. So the skate wheels on that robot are passive. It's just motors at the joints that are making this thing locomote. The superstructure that's sticking up on the top of the robot is a little stereo camera thing with accelerometers in it so that the robot can figure out how it's oriented. It learns well enough that if you start it pointing not in the direction that you want it to go, but perpendicular to that direction, it knows not to just parallel park its way to the right the whole time. It's smart enough to make a right angle turn and then start doing the snake locomotion thing. So absolutely, reinforcement learning is the way to go if you have unmodeled dynamics. So I can approximate the mechanics of that wheeled robot with curvature plots if the wheels don't slip, but Jesse's floor is slippery. And so as soon as the wheels start slipping, you need to use machine learning to sort of suss out what to do in the presence of that model uncertainty. I think I've made the gate design problem intuitive, but it might still bother you that there's something unintuitive about the mechanics of locomotion in this driftless environment, right? Because it's different from the environment of water in your swimming pool, where you can paddle a little bit and then stop and you'll glide, right? So I'll tell you how I think of the mechanics of swimming in this environment. I'll give you another metaphor. Imagine you were sitting in a perfectly round boat and you had an umbrella. You could rotate the boat by opening the umbrella, twisting the umbrella, closing the umbrella, and untwisting the umbrella. I'll show that video again. Watch the crossbar as an indication of the orientation of the boat. So the sequence of maneuvers I'm going to do is open, then twist, then close, and then untwist. The reason I bother untwisting at the end is that at the end of that maneuver, internally, as far as the actuation of opening and closing umbrella is concerned, I've restored the umbrella to its initial state, but I managed to turn the boat. How did I manage to turn the boat? Well, when the umbrella is open, it's harder to spin than when the umbrella is closed. Its rotational inertia is bigger when I open the umbrella than when I close the umbrella. So by varying how hard the umbrella is to turn, when it's hard to turn, it counter turns the boat more. When I close it and then turn it back, it's easier to turn, so it counter turns the boat less. This is another problem that I can talk about entirely in terms of curvature. So the loop that I've been showing in this movie is that little round rectangular path over the piece of graph paper that is openness and twistedness, and that yellow surface indicates the distribution of curvature. So in fact, it's interesting if you want to do this experiment the next time you're out in a lake with an umbrella, don't go out in a lake if there's going to be lightning, there is a particular umbrella openness angle that is optimal. So you see the ridge on that curvature plot, if you're gonna do the open, twist, close, untwist maneuver, there's a particular degree of openness that you should center that around to get the most leverage out of your umbrella. It's not all the way open and it's not all the way closed. It's in between in a way that depends on the mass of the umbrella relative to that of the boat, which I think is interesting. Anyway, so I think the right way to think about how this little guy swims in this drift-free environment is not only, it's all about pushing against the environment. And not only is the resistance to rotation of that robot's body dependent upon its current shape, but so is its resistance to translation. Each of those ellipses is easier to push through the fluid the long way than laterally. And so a good swimming gait is one that exploits pushing with the side of an ellipse against pushing with the long way of an ellipse in order to move toward the long way ellipse. I said that poorly, but I think the intuition is probably clear in your mind. Anyway, I'm probably about out of time. I want to end with a teaser though. So let me just give you one of many examples of the screwy things that can happen in that intermediate range when the fluid dynamics of a robot in a fluid do not dramatically simplify. So one day, a couple of summers ago, I decided that I was going to try to make the simplest possible robot, because I thought, we need a really simple robot in the lab so that we can study things like, I don't know, coordinated behavior of schools of these things and so forth. So I took a piece of foam insulation. It's because that insulation that you buy at Lowe's is pink that all my animations of swimming robots are pink. So I took a piece of foam insulation, I cut it in a teardrop shape, and then all the other bits that go into a robot, like a motor and batteries and stuff, I just put them on top. So that's a foam teardrop with some heavy stuff on top. And I'm controlling this with a little remote control joystick so that I can twist the heavy stuff back and forth. When I twist the heavy stuff back and forth, that makes the foam teardrop twist forth and back. And because it's round on one end and pointy on the other, it swims forward, right? It's the fishiest thing you could imagine, right? And it's only 1 degree of freedom. So I'm filming this with my phone in one hand, and I'm just wiggling a joystick back and forth with the other hand. So here's that robot swimming toward us. This is my backyard pool. You can see, do some fluid visualization in the shadow underneath. But anyway, here's this thing, I'm wiggling the joystick back and forth. It's undulating its way toward us. Soon it will reach this end of the pool. When it reaches this end of the pool, how am I going to get it to turn around and go the other way? Obviously, it's only 1 degree of freedom. Obviously, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep spinning the rotor in the same direction for a while, right? I've been wiggling the rotor back and forth to make the tail go back and forth and back. It gets to this end of the pool. I'm going to keep spinning the rotor in one direction. The robot will counter rotate until it's pointing away from me, and then I'll go back to the back and forth thing, right? Nothing could be more obvious about that. Look how simple a device it is. Let me tell you something you can do with soup. You know what a lazy Susan is, right? One of these circular platforms on a table where you can rotate the platform around its center. Get a bowl of soup and float little bits of styrofoam in a row along inside this bowl of soup centered on the lazy Susan. When I spin the lazy Susan, obviously the styrofoam bits cease to be aligned with each other, right? But what happens when you grab the lazy Susan and stop it? The styrofoam bits are going to re-line up. I was amazed when I saw that the first time. I didn't expect that at all. Here's a better version of that experiment done by a friend of mine in University of Waterloo. So we're now looking at a petri dish with beads and little angle markers sitting on a fancy lab lazy Susan. We spin the petri dish, the little beads that are floating in the fluid are misaligned. None of them is on the 0 line anymore. But when you stop the Petri dish from spinning, they all go back to being not only in line with each other, but back to the same line that they were on to begin with. Crazy, crazy stuff. Makes me anxious. Since this was a surprise, it makes me anxious about this problem, and indeed I should be. So I remember vividly this morning, I'm swimming the robot along. I think to myself, okay, it's going to get to this end of the pool. I'll spin the heavy bits one way to turn the robot around and have it swim away, and then I'll end the video. I start to try to turn the robot and it gets stuck at a certain orientation. I give up and it points back at me. I'm like, no, come on. So I try again, spin, 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 spin. You can do that for 5 minutes. It'll get stuck. And when you give up, it'll come back and end up stopping, pointing at you again. In fact, I had a student do elaborate versions of this experiment where he spun and spun and spun that rotor. He could get it to turn 360 degrees all the way around, as I recall. And when he stopped spinning the rotor, that robot would turn all the way back around and point right at him again. So that's a real obstacle to getting a robot like this that I thought was the simplest robot in the world to navigate around in a pool. How do you solve that problem? I don't know, you'll have to invite me back for another talk for me to tell you that. Let me wrap up with lessons. So there are 2 lessons. The principal part of the talk, the lesson was, you can start with a problem that seems opaque. How am I gonna like search over the space of all ways to get joints to move to get a good swimming gait? And it turns out that if you come up with the right weird way to look at the problem, it can turn a complicated problem into something very intuitive. On the other hand, watching my video, you feel, high and mighty after, making a realization like what you see in red there. On the other hand, all around you, things that you think are simple might very well turn out to be really complicated. So there are all kinds of challenges in, even in the simplest toy problems that arise in engineering. That's why I like simple toy problems when I do these sorts of things. Sam in the chat says this is the Coriolis effect. I think that's a Wobblestone joke. But anyway, props to Sam. Actually, there have been 80 things in the chat that I have not read, so I'm sure there were other good comments. Sorry about that. But I'll stop there and take questions if anyone has questions or comments.
Yeah, I have a question, if you don't mind.
Please.
You said that simple robot that you made, every time you stop it, it will turn around and point at you.
Yes.
And you said that's a problem that needs to be solved. But why does it always turn around and point at you? Why doesn't it just keep swimming at the last direction that you pointed it at?
So a complete answer to that question is complicated, but I can give you a partial answer. So the reason is there is something like a conservation law in the dynamics of that thing, which it's not conservation of a momentum-like quantity. It's a sort of conservation of the accumulated effect of you winding the robot up in one way and an accumulated reaction that depends specifically on the kind of drag on the robot. That was a bad way of saying that, but here I can improve that a little bit. So let me point out in this movie, better still this movie. So if you've taken a fluid mechanics class, you know that the sort of friction, the sort of drag there is between adjacent laminae in that fluid is linear in velocity. If that's a Newtonian fluid, then if one layer of fluid drags over the other layer of fluid, the resistance is proportional to the speed at which that occurs. You can show that in a simplified model, whenever that's true, when the drag is precisely linear in speed, there'll be this weird conservation law-like thing that leads to self-recovery of this kind. And by the way, I have a small group of friends who sort of all discovered this simultaneously about 10 years ago. It's unbelievable to all of us that this phenomenon isn't well documented in the mechanics literature from hundreds of years ago. I cannot believe that so elementary a phenomenon went undetected, but we haven't been able to find the references. Like, I always think Euler knew everything, but I have not found it in Euler that this was observed. But anyway, it specifically depends on linear drag. So, if you had the task of modeling the fluid dynamics of this thing, you look at those vortices being shed, you'd think, well, okay, there's like, it's not just linear drag, right? I mean, we learn about drag coefficients, there's quadratic drag, there's all this stuff with vortex shedding and so forth. The extent to which this self-recovery thing happens is the extent to which linear drag, linear in velocity, viscous drag is the model for drag on the system. So beyond that, I could send you, we wrote some papers about exactly how it comes out of the math, but it's totally surprising. So your question is a very reasonable question that I didn't really fully answer.
Dr. Kelly, do you think that you could get to a point where you could create, I think you almost said it, but the effect of what they call oil whip or oil whir, where you can get the rotational forces going one direction to be opposite that of the force that you're putting on it, like you would see slippage in a vertical turbine shaft in a water pump situation?
So I probably know less about the analogy that you're making than you do, but you may have correctly identified the solution to this problem. So because the self-recovery thing actually happens only approximately and depends on this linear drag phenomenon. So when I try to turn that robot slowly and continuously by spinning the rotor one way, the other way continuously, I'm sort of maximizing the role of linear drag in its rotational dynamics. But if I do a little ratcheting motion, I can bleed off this phenomenon with little kicks by shedding vortices off the tail of that thing. So I can do a sort of, with a bunch of little kicks, I can slowly turn this thing around. And that is the sort of correct way to do that. I'm not sure if that has anything to do with the thing that you proposed, but that is sort of the solution. I mean, the modeling description of it is sort of more interesting than that, but there is a way around this problem. And the whole problem is trying to turn it around smoothly is the wrong thing to do.
I'll make a comment regarding the little video you showed just recently about the three balls that end up lining up to one another again. It seems similar to a phenomena that the YouTuber Smarter Every Day discussed in one of his videos, where he was showing you why you get motion sickness in, like, let's say a jet, for example. And there was a kind of a experiment where you sit on a chair and someone will spin you around, and eventually she'll stop you and she'll ask you, are you still spinning? And it feels as if you are, because the fluid in your ear is spinning and it's dragging on the hairs in your ear. But as you're speeding up, as your body spins and the fluid is still, the hairs drag through the fluid, speeding the fluid up. At some point you reach a sort of steady state where both are spinning at the same rate. You stop and the fluid keeps spinning until the drag from the hair slows it back down. It seems to be a similar thing happening, where as you spin, the fluid is speeding up those balls. And then as you stop, the balls end up coming to a stop through the drag of the fluid not spinning anymore, and then coming back to the same point, which is interesting. But
that is an interesting comment, Tyler. In fact, I'll share a personal anecdote just because I was surprised that the following thing existed at all. But yeah, so you've got this vestibular system that helps you, maintain balance, that involves your these semicircular canals that are full of fluid that have little hair cells in them. So when I shake my head around, the fluid sloshes, it tickles the hairs. The hairs are arranged along a line so they have different sensitivities to different frequencies. So there's interesting things about the design of artificial hair sets. So I've done some work with people who make artificial hair cells as flow sensors that you can line your robots with. This is what the little dotted line on the side of a fish is, a bunch of little hair cells like the one in your cochlea. But anyway, I learned from personal experience recently that these little crystals in that fluid can get loose so that you suffer from perpetual vertigo. And there are these physical exercises you can do to restore the arrangement of the crystals in that fluid, and you can find instructions online. I mean, don't do this unless you're experiencing chronic vertigo. But I was experiencing chronic vertigo last year. And the solution was to do these exercises where you sit on the edge of your bed and then suddenly slam yourself sideways into the bed repeatedly. And then slowly roll over to the other side and then sit up. And doing that realigns stuff in your head, which I thought was fascinating, but it totally
interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. So I'll tell you another example of another manifestation of this phenomenon. So if you're not familiar with Andy Ruina, he's a professor at Cornell. I guess he's retired now. He's like threshold of emeritus professor at Cornell. Andy is one of the most interesting guys I know. So his whole career has been fun little surprising things with mechanical devices. So he was famous partly for work in passive dynamic walking. Like, do you need your robot, your walking robot, to be a powered thing, or is it, or could you make something that was just so precisely balanced that if you put it on even the smallest of ramps, it would just walk along passively indefinitely, because our walking is mostly a matter of sort of passive mechanics. So Andy made passive dynamic walkers. He's also known for, you've probably heard that the reason your bicycle doesn't fall down when you're rolling, but does fall down when you stay still, has something to do with gyroscopic stabilization. So Andy was the guy who showed that that's not true, because he built a bicycle with extra wheels next to the ordinary wheels, so that next to each wheel that was spinning one way, there's a wheel that spins the other way, but just doesn't touch the ground. And he showed that even that bicycle that cancels out all its own gyroscopic stabilization doesn't fall down if you give it a push. So it has more to do with interactions of the tires with the ground, which I thought was a surprise. But anyway, Andy in class wanted to do the demo of if he stands on a Lazy Susan and goes like this with his arm. So the umbrella thing, astronauts do this to reorient themselves floating in space. You stick your arms out so they have a lot of inertia. You move your arms to the side, you tuck them in and move them back. And every time you do whatever 60s dance this was with your arms, your body counter rotates, right? That's the umbrella thing. So he tried to do this demo in class, standing on a Lazy Susan, but every time he'd do it, he'd then rotate back to the front. And he thought, okay, the room is tilted. So he very carefully balanced the room and did it, made a very balanced platform with the Lazy Susan on top, did it again, and nope, he reoriented again. So he actually mounted to the ceiling of his living room to make sure it wasn't like gravity pulling him to a tilt. He mounted to the ceiling of his living room a Lazy Susan with like a trapeze hanging down. Now, Andy, he's not the most athletic guy, so he made his wife do this, and I've seen the video of his wife hung from the ceiling and did a twisty body thing to try to rotate like an astronaut in space. And darn it, every time she'd stop the experiment, she'd rotate all the way back. And it turned out the reason was there's viscous damping in the Lazy Susan bearing. And so he, like, in parallel with my friend Dong Yi, who made this video, the soup video, and me playing with the swimming robots, like, we all kind of came across this phenomenon simultaneously. Andy was also the guy who showed that if you take a rope ladder and make the rungs zigzaggy and drop that ladder, that it will fall faster than a normal rope ladder. Once the bottom of the ladder starts hitting the ground, the interaction of the zigzaggy rungs with the ground, whacking the ground, will pull the ladder down faster than a normal falling rope ladder, which is crazy, but that's the same phenomenon as the chain fountain phenomenon, which you may have seen on YouTube, where you take like one of these key ring chains full of balls in a jar, and you begin siphoning that key ring out of the jar, and it will actually rise up like a fountain. These are all things that were surprises to the world just within the last 15 years. So even, this is why I like mechanics and dynamics. There are elementary toy problems that are still surprising and being discovered every day. Anyway, that was a long aside. As you can see, I really like toys.
It's always most interesting to find what you're not looking for.
I got a quick question if I can ask one.
Hey, Archer.
Hey, so great talk. Thanks a lot. Really enjoyed it. So one thing I found surprising was that you had these plots of curvature with the head and tail angle. And so I was wondering, does it depend on the trajectory of the head and tail angle, or for a fixed head and tail angle, you get a certain curvature?
Oh, yeah, let me zoom back while answering that question. So the idea is that in the head, and so the labels on those axes are tiny, but that is a picture of the range from minus 3 pi over 4 to pi over 4 in each of those two angles. So in the plane that covers the range of all joint angles, there is a continuous function, which is local curvature, So that, in fact, this is a Stokes theorem thing. I'll talk the talk since you're a professor. So the idea is really, if you close a loop anywhere in that plane and you want to calculate how far do you move as a result, you can turn that into an area integral, and the integrand is the curvature. And there's three.
Okay, I see. So if you just stay at a fixed point, you don't move, but it's the loop that gets you to move.
Yeah, and one corollary to that is you have to make a loop that encloses area. So if you did a joint angle motion where both joints moved exactly in phase, so like either a thing where it just opened and closed like a scallop because both joints were turning together, or one where both joints zig and zag simultaneously in phase, in that plane, that would be just going back and forth along an arc, but it wouldn't enclose any area. So you can see without testing those gates, but that like won't generate any motion. In fact, I have a video. I made exactly this robot out of styrofoam ellipses. So swimming in that same swimming pool from the other video, I can show you a video of, you know, a 5-foot-long styrofoam one of these, and it snakes along to the other end of the pool. And then at the other end of the pool, it tries to go like this to swim, and it just goes back and forth in place. And then it tries to zigzag to swim, and it just goes back and forth in place, which gives you a sense for like, you'd never consider the water in my pool to be the inviscid extreme of fluid mechanics. And yet it's totally close enough for this to be a good model of how a relatively streamlined raft moves in my swimming pool.
Cool, yeah, thanks.
And by the way, for true experts, when I say curvature, this is curvature in the Riemannian geometry sense. So if you're a mathy person, you know, this is like, I've got a connection on a principal bundle, and I'm computing the local curvature of that connection. Shout out to the mathematical physicists in our audience.
Hey, Scott, I got a question.
Yeah,
I don't remember, I took your class, obviously, so this would be familiar to me, but can you have a loop that encircles curvature that intersects with itself like a figure eight?
yeah, for sure. But if it does that, then you could, you know, the amount of locomotion, you could just do the computation of the two separate lobes and add them up. Right?
Yeah.
But I think, you know, one way to design a good, I'm just looking at these pictures, if I wanted the thing to, you know, rotate but not translate, I could do something where, you know, I go around one way, but then I go back around the other way to like cancel out the movement in one direction, but not cancel out the movement in the other degree of freedom or something. So in fact, direction reversals are a useful thing. But yeah, if I take any of these loops and I just go the other way, I get exactly the opposite movement. And so using, you know, back and forth crisscrossing loops is totally a sensible thing to do. You know, Lissajous figures. I just wanted to say Lissajous
Cool.
figures.
Hey, thanks.
For some reason we like sines and cosines, right? As a basis for doing these things, right? That's head is doing sine t and tail is doing cos t. And I should point out that in this situation, in this driftless situation, the dynamics are invariant under time parameterization. So whether you do the motion really fast or really slowly, like if it takes you a year or it takes you a second, at the end of that loop, you will have moved the same amount. So some of the simplification that occurs is this like time invariance of the dynamics. Whereas drifty things, it matters. Did you do it quickly? Did you do it slowly? You'll drift differently afterwards.
Dr. Kelly, do you ever build these robots not symmetrically and maybe with, you know, antinodes or nodes so that you can get different moments around these, like longer chains, not, you know, just, you know, one on each side, a head and a tail, but it seems like maybe a longer snake could swim faster.
Yeah, absolutely. So the I'll tell you just a few variants on this, because you can, I mean, you can run with the idea of making chains of things to make robots, right? So I definitely had a student who had a whole story about fat head versus skinny head robot, right? You know, he made ellipses so that it was tapering one way, or, you know, is it better to have fat at both ends and just a stick in the middle and so forth? And there's, you know, all kinds of stories. But another variation, so yes, another variation is, what if I only have an actuator on one joint and the rest of the joints here there's only one other joint, but I could make it long chain. What if the rest of the joints are just springs? So then the timing matters. So I have movies I can show you because I have a ton of stuff about this, and it's pretty interesting actually. In fact, let me say this whole paragraph because there's a neat punchline. So what if I make this robot and one joint is a motor, but the other joint is a spring? So springs, because they have spring constants, introduce an absolute time scale to the problem. So if I wiggle the driven joint at a certain frequency, I get a certain responsiveness to the other joint. And if I wiggle at a different frequency, I get a different amount of responsiveness. So then the problem is, in this curvature plane, I'm making the black loop go back and forth along one axis, but the spring is deciding how to move along the other axis. So the find the best gate problem turns into the problem of excite the one degree of freedom so that dynamically what emerges is the best possible loop limit cycle for the dynamics people in the audience in that joint angle plane, which is an interesting dynamics problem. That leads to the question of, if you really do this with real robots, do you save any power by having one joint be a spring? So imagine you have, before you answer, I see you opening your mouth. Imagine you have a motor and a spring. Drive the motor, you see what the spring does, and the thing swims. Okay, now you go back and you replace the spring with a second motor, but have it do exactly the same motion as it did with the spring. So one view is, okay, the deformation of the robot was exactly the same. The fluid was exactly the same. So everything that happened in the system was exactly the same. So it must be that the total amount of power you put in was the same, because the robot, like everything moved the same way. But then again, the other view would be, yeah, but the front motor is making that joint do exactly the same thing in both cases. So if in the other case, the second motor is doing anything, then you're like using more power in the two motor case. I thought that was a really good conundrum. Like when I gave conference talks about, after we did that paper, like I would pose that and, show of hands, audience full of professor people, and, ask the audience, never had a good answer to that question. The answer is you totally use only half as much power if you have only one motor. Even though the robot moves exactly the same way, and even though the environment moves the same way, replacing the springs is a power saving device. So you definitely want to make passive elastic swimmers and excite them to resonate. In fact, to all the people in the audience who do like wave energy harvesting type things, I'm always surprised that people make passive devices to suck energy out of the ocean instead of making, I know some people make elastic devices that resonate, but you should make all the devices elastic devices that resonate. Elastic resonance is a great way to like get energy for free, and ditto for swimming robots.
I have a question, like, how would you put it, like the head and the tail as being in the optimal phase difference, or the speed of the head and the tail?
So I think for this example problem, the picture we are looking at is, contains everything to answer the question about optimal. I don't claim that this movie is optimal. I claim that you have to start with a goal of how much do you want to move forward versus sideways versus rotate. And then optimal is relative to that goal is whatever loop best achieves that. So I'll tell you one thing that people do by default. I said that green was a 0 point. So people, although I was one of the people that sort of first came up with this idea, there's a community of us that play with the same metaphor. So a standard thing to do is, not necessarily for this problem, but just in general for a problem where you have these curvature plots as a design paradigm, is to pick loops that move along the 0 level set of curvature. So you figure that you want a loop that has all hot curvature on the left and all cold curvature on the right, bearing in mind the interesting topology where that's the skin of a donut, so you can go through the donut hole. So, excuse me, in these pictures, it looks like there's a lot of 0 curvature, but that's just because of the scale that I've chosen. There are, in fact, contours through that space that are precisely this is the curve along which curvature is 0, right? Because it's like a topographic map. And so if you choose your scaling of the colors, there is a 0 elevation contour. And so one way to think of optimum is following the contour that is the zero elevation contour around the red zone if you're trying to go red, or the blue zone if you're trying to go blue. But I think really the answer to is this, what's optimum is there isn't just one global optimum, because it's a like non-convex problem and you didn't tell me what you wanted to optimize for anyway.
I have a quick question, Dr. Kelly.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming we're kind of looking at this as like a packet of fluid, right? Almost like a stagnant flow field that the robot's moving in.
It's a
because of the
flow. Yeah.
I'm assuming because of the scale. So my thinking is, if it were to be scaled so that the robot was larger and the field of fluid was smaller, to where it would actually see the effects of, say, a directional flow, would that still potentially act in the same way with just like some linear addition or subtraction of the drag caused by the flow of the fluid?
So let me unravel the difference between the two extremes. So what's the same at the low Reynolds number extreme? You're a junior, I think. So I can use these words, right? So what's different between the low Reynolds number extreme and the inviscid extreme is the physical mechanism whereby these curvature plots arise. So in the inviscid extreme, the idea is that momentum is actually conserved. So there's no vorticity in the fluid. The fluid slips freely over the surface of the body. Therefore, the body surrounded by the fluid is really just like a body in space, but with the weird property that its inertia depends on the direction. So a normal object in space, its mass is the same whether you move it this way or move it that way. The body in an inviscid fluid is just like a body in space, except its mass is directionally dependent. It's easier to go one way, harder to go the other way, sort of the skinny way or the other way. But there's no drag exactly. The only fluid effect is added mass. At the other extreme, the low Reynolds number extreme, the little tiny things in water extreme, there are no inertia effects. So it is 100% a viscous drag phenomenon. And in that extreme, the drag is linear in speed, just because that's what happens at that extreme. So the intermediate range that I think you're suggesting, in which you get sort of the other kinds of hydrodynamic drag that you know from your fluids class, like as soon as you have any kind of interesting drag that's not linear in speed, in parallel with added mass effects, things just become complicated. Like there's all kinds of dynamics that are simply not covered by this model. If anything, I'm always surprised at how well, when I make a thing out of styrofoam and it's 5 feet long and throw it in my pool, this metaphor actually works well, but that's absolutely not a claim that it ought to. Like mathematically, there's all kinds of, the pointy robot that wiggled like this, just because it had a point on the end, that ruined this model because there were vortices being shed. So I think, all the phenomena you're thinking of are just out of bounds for this model.
Yeah, so I got one other question is, are your pumps on in your pool when you're doing this, or is the water stagnant?
We turn off the pumps, but it's outdoors, so it's windy. It's perpetually annoying. We want to do stuff in the pool on campus, but you can't get that to stay still either. Talk to my student Jesse. He's driving around the area looking for like stagnant lakes when there's no one around, because we've got the nice stereo camera sensors. We can throw robots in the lakes and they'll know where they are. But it's really hard to get a flat body of water. If you have a flat body of water that we can use that's pretty big, please let me know. Artur, who asked a question earlier, is building a flat body of water in the motorsports lab, and I'm looking forward to throwing robots in it for just that reason. Outdoors is impossible. There's too much wind, especially if your robot is styrofoam, right? It just blows away.
So Dr. Kelly, this goes back. You said the elastic resonance, and if you already know the complete mass and all of the properties of the structure itself, then couldn't you generate the rotation that you would need to come across multiple modes of resonance, knowing the object's natural frequency? So therefore you could have a motor spin at that natural frequency and maybe excite like a fifth mode of the resonance. So therefore you're getting like 5 times the amplified output for the one set of work. This blows my mind, but I think that you could shoot across that plane so fast using minimal energy.
So I'll say a couple of things, but actually, because for a second Rob popped up, and so in case I'm reading his mind correctly, let me say a couple of things. I'll stay here and talk to whoever wants to stay indefinitely, but I feel like maybe one should point out that it is not impolite to leave if you didn't mean to stay here for more than 90 minutes. Before you leave, donate money because of the fundraising campaign, because it's the right thing to do. But otherwise, I mean, stick around. I'm not asking you to leave at all. I'm just saying, like don't feel like I'll be hurt if you adjourn. Some of you have like classes tomorrow and so forth. Do any of you have classes with me tomorrow? No, you don't. So anyway, so in answer to your question, the problem of knowing the modes of vibration for a wiggly thing in a fluid is that they're not the same as the modes of vibration of that wiggly thing when it's not in a fluid. So you put the wiggly thing in the fluid and the fluid affects the modes of vibration, but the fluid affects the modes of vibration also in a complicated way. So there are things like, if I make a whippy thing and I excite some vibratory mode of that whippy thing, one thing that'll happen at the pointy end is vortices will be shed, and those will be sucking energy off the object. So it could be that there's a certain crossover point in how much you energize that resonating stick, beyond which, if you try to energize it more because of its internal resonances, the amount of energy that the fluid dynamics are sucking away, ends up making it like you're losing rather than gaining in that situation. So, I mean, some interesting points about vortex shedding. I mean, just an object moving through a fluid, will have sort of natural, depending on the flow speed, will have natural frequencies at which vortex shedding occurs. If you when the wind blows over the grass and you hear a whistling sound, that frequency is the carbon vortex street shedding frequency, off the grass or off the electrical wires, right? By the way, if you get a chance, read the history of the discovery of the phenomenon of Kármán vortex shedding off cylinders, right? So people in fluids classes, right? You put a cylinder in a flow, you blow fluid this way, and at some point, as you speed the fluid up, it starts doing this oscillatory thing where it sheds vortices. And you think, if I weren't learning that in a class, that would seem really unlikely, because that's an asymmetric phenomenon, even though the setup of the problem is symmetric. Yeah, indeed, when that was first observed in the lab, let's see, who were the players? Was von Kármán the student? And was the advisor somebody like Prandtl or Fuppel, or I don't remember who, we'd have to look it up. But it was very much one of these, okay, student, you did the experiment, not carefully enough, go back and fix it. So the student goes and does it more carefully and comes back and says, I still see the vortex shedding phenomenon. No, go back and fix it again, right? Anyway, so there's an interplay between the elastic resonances of something that's wiggling in a fluid and things like natural vortex shedding frequencies and loss of energy to those phenomena that sort of, that make that problem hard, right? There's a toy that was marketed for a while in the 1990s called a twiddlefish, and it was a stick like a pencil, and then perpendicular to the pencil there was a rubber ribbon, and the idea was if you lowered the ribbon into the water and went like this with your hands, causing the ribbon to wiggle in the water, at the right frequency, suddenly the ribbon would shove your hand really hard to swim through the water. So you're absolutely right that's a good way to do that. But like finding that frequency, and should it be the same frequency for accelerating as for swimming at a constant speed, right? Because no matter how hard you accelerate, you're going to reach some sort of terminal velocity. There are all kinds of interesting research questions. In fact, if you want to work on this, I don't even know who you are, but we should have a conversation. Like there's lots of interesting research problems to do concerning exciting elastic things in fluids.
I happen to be a part-time grad student in applied energy and electromechanical systems and need to pass mechatronics next semester.
It can wait. So, you know, anytime. There are summers in between. That's the best time to play in a pool anyway.
That's a Big Ten for.
Well, thank you, Scott. I tell you what, you were the inaugural, and I think you're going to be hard to beat in the future for other speakers. You did a fantastic job, and I love the participation. Christine, is he going to be able to look back at the chat? Because I have to say, I agree with him. The chat has been very entertaining. I've been
Yes, it
really
has
enjoying
been.
it as well.
Yes, the chat's actually saved, so he will be able to look back. Yes, it's been great. It really
You may
has
want to
been.
look at it, Scott. You've got a great fan club there, I think, with a lot of people. So you did a wonderful job. Thank you so much.
Some of them are going to be receiving grades from me this semester. So if, you know, we'll have to see who said nice things in the chat, right? Before I go pat myself on the back. But anyway, no, this was a delight. I mean, again, thanks for the invitation. You know, when we go back to doing these things in person, if you ever need a speaker to talk about something, you know, there are other things that I would love to talk about.
We will definitely reach out to you again. So thank you so much. And we'd like to thank everybody for attending. And again, if you guys could go to hashtag Niner Nation Gives, that would be wonderful. We'd love to have the support. But I tell you, we really appreciate the support of all of you attending this event tonight. I think you guys, together with Scott, ended up making this just a wonderful inaugural event. So thank you very much for everything. And everybody take care and have a wonderful evening.